Welcome to You Have My Sword. Today we are diving into the history of Sting. Not the musician, no, but the iconic sword. I don't think I can get away with another music joke after last episode, but let it be known, I really, really want to. Let's talk about it. First, of course, we are going to answer a listener question, and Dave writes, do I need to read or listen to The Hobbit before Lord of the Rings? Okay, so I would personally say that the answer is age and or maturity dependent. If the person doing the reading is a fully grown adult with an adult reading level and reading taste, then The Hobbit with its folksy charms could very well turn off a reader to the glory that is Tolkien's world, if that makes sense. An adult, mature reader should maybe start with Lord of the Rings, I would suggest. On the other hand, a young reader should certainly begin with The Hobbit because that was intended for a young audience when Tolkien wrote it. And it reads as such. It reads more fairy tale than high fantasy, if that makes sense. So don't let the fantasy tag fool you. The Lord of the Rings is an adult book with grown-up themes and will be beyond all but the most advanced of young readers. And while not mentioned in the question, the Silmarillion should most likely only be tackled after a love and respect for Middle-earth has been grown in the reader by reading both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. For context, The Hobbit was I believe it was 8th grade, part of my 8th grade reading curriculum, if that kind of gives any color to the age group that The Hobbit was kind of written for. So while it reads a little YA, I guess, which could turn off some readers, I still think it's super fun. It's an easy read. You could probably blow through it very quickly. But there's no harm, no foul in starting with Lord of the Rings and then going back and reading The Hobbit for, a little prequel magic. So I hope that answers your question. And I'm excited for you to read both Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and hopefully the Silmarillion. Okay, so the meat of this episode, we are talking about Sting, which we know to be both Bilbo and Frodo Baggins' sword. So the history of Sting begins millennia before the Lord of the Rings, and most of it, in fact, belongs to the first and second ages of Middle-earth. However, about all we know of this vast period of thousands of years is that Sting was presumably, along with the more famous elven swords Glamdring, who we did an episode on in season 1 in Orcrist, were made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars. Now, by the late Third Age, a group of trolls dwelling in the Etten Moors, not far from Rivendell, had come into possession of the elven blades, and we do see this in the Hobbit films. How? Well, Elrond speculated, one may guess that your trolls had plundered other plunderers or come on the remnants of old robberies in some hold in the mountains. Makes sense, right? Burglars, burgling, burglars. Say that shit 3 times fast. Regardless, in the year 2941, in the Third Age, the blade that would come to be known as Sting came into the possession of a new plunderer, Bilbo Baggins Esquire. Bilbo's goofy ass loves to flex that he's an esquire. I wonder what the Shire bar exam is like. So here is a quote from when Bilbo discovered Sting. There were lots of clothes, too, hanging on the walls, too small for trolls. I am afraid they belonged to victims, and among them were several swords of various makes, shapes, and sizes. Two caught their eyes particularly, because of their beautiful scabbards and jeweled hilts. Gandalf and Thorin each took one of these, and Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. It would have made only a tiny pocket knife for a troll, but it was as good as a short sword for the hobbit. So while Sting was a shorter sword, in the hands of a hobbit, it was a mighty sword. Now, from this point forward, we have the ability to kind of construct a much richer and more detailed history of Sting. The first actual use Bilbo found for his sword, which Bilbo had mostly forgotten about up to that point, came in the goblin tunnels beneath the Misty Mountains, where he was mostly useless. At the very least, it kept Gollum from snatching and eating Bilbo, which led to the riddle game. In the entire novel of The Hobbit, it may be astonishing to realize that Bilbo used Sting exactly once against the giant spiders of Mirkwood Forest. Crazy, right? You find a sick-ass ancient sword and you just forget about it? The least realistic thing in The Hobbit, or Lord of the Rings, or Tolkien's universe at large, honestly. How are you going to find an ancient sword and then forget about it? Anyways, so here's a quote. Things were looking pretty bad again when suddenly Bilbo reappeared and charged into the astonished spiders unexpectedly from the side. Go on, he shouted. I will do the stinging. And he did. He darted backwards and forwards, slashing at spider threads, hacking at their legs, and stabbing at their fat bodies if they came too near. The spiders swelled with rage and spluttered and frothed and hissed out horrible curses, but they had become mortally afraid of Sting. Bilbo did the damn thing. He stood up for himself, and I mean, some of the scariest shit that goes down in Middle-earth has to do with these spiders. So we have to give Bilbo some credit here. Okay, so after returning to Bag End, Bilbo hung Sting over the mantelpiece where it collected dust for decades. Presumably, Bilbo took Sting with him on his trip to Erebor sometime after the year 2989, and he certainly brought it with him when he settled down at Rivendell in the year 3002. And then in the year 3018, Bilbo gifted it to Frodo Baggins, which kicks off some exciting moments in Sting's history. So while Bilbo kind of squandered his time with Sting, thankfully we have Frodo, who kind of comes in, is the heir of this sword now, and finally does some sick shit with it. Here's another quote. I should just read the book to you guys at this point, right? Anyways, Bilbo took from the box a small sword in an old shabby leather scabbard. Then he drew it, and its polished and well-tended blade glittered suddenly, cold and bright. This is Sting, he said, and thrust it with little effort deep into a wooden beam. Take it, if you like. I shan't want it again, I expect. What a fucking dork. Bilbo seems like the kind of guy that does accounting homework for fun. With peace and love to all of my accountants listening, of course. But hey, thank goodness Bilbo thought to arm his adopted heir with an elvish blade, because it certainly came in handy during the short but vicious melee in the Chamber of Marzabul, deep inside the mines of Moria, when little baby Frodo taught a cave troll to fear him. Guess what? It's time for another quote. Suddenly, and to his own surprise, Frodo felt a hot wrath blaze up in his heart. The Shire, he cried, and springing beside Boromir, he stooped and stabbed with Sting at the hideous foot. There was a bellow, and the foot jerked back, nearly wrenching Sting from Frodo's arm. Black drops dripped from the blade and smoked on the floor. Boromir hurled himself against the door and slammed it again. One for the Shire, cried Aragorn. The hobbit's bite is deep. You have a good blade, Frodo, son of Drogo. Ah, we love to see it. Now, it was many weeks later when Frodo finally drew Sting from its sheath, frightening Gollum away from the elvish boat where Frodo was laying. And it's quote time again, you little rascals. Frodo was just yielding to the temptation to lie down again when a dark shape, hardly visible, floated close to one of the moored boats. A long whitish hand could be dimly seen as it shot out and grabbed the gunwale. Two pale, lamp-like eyes shone coldly as they peered inside, and then they lifted and gazed up at Frodo on the yacht. They were not more than 1 or 2 yards away, and Frodo heard the soft hiss of intaken breath. He stood up, drawing Sting from its sheath, and faced the eyes. Immediately their light was shut off. There was another hiss and a splash, and the dark log shape shot away downstream into the night. A short while later, Frodo drew it for a different purpose. "Let us see what Sting may show," answered Aragorn. Frodo then drew the elf blade from its sheath. To his dismay, the edges gleamed dimly in the night. "Orcs," he said, "not very near, and yet too near, it seems." Sting would not be unsheathed again until Frodo's fateful meeting with Smeagol, who was then busy trying to murder Samwise. Things would have gone ill with Sam if he had been alone, but Frodo sprang up and drew Sting from its sheath. With his left hand, he drew back Gollum's head by his thin, lank hair, scratching his long neck and forcing his pale, venomous eyes to stare up at the sky. "Let go, Gollum," he said. "This is Sting. You have seen it before once upon a time. Let go, or you'll feel it this time. I'll cut your throat." Gollum collapsed and went as loose as wet string. Sam got up, fingering his shoulder. His eyes smoldered with anger. So, pretty fucking tough of Frodo to be so brazen like that. And as you can see, Frodo is a way better wielder of Sting than Bilbo was. Now, the next time Frodo drew his blade was in Ithilien when unexpectedly encountering Faramir's rangers. At once, 4 men came striding through the fern from different directions. Since flight and hiding were no longer possible, Frodo and Sam sprang to their feet, putting back to back and whipping out their small swords. Bilbo would have been a bit nostalgic and quite proud of his adopted son to see his next use of Sting against a giant spider not unlike the ones Bilbo once slew by the dozens in Mirkwood Forest. We love a callback. Frodo's heart flamed within him, and without thinking what he did, whether it was folly or despair or courage, he took the phial in his left hand and with his right hand drew his sword. Sting flashed out, and the sharp elven blade sparkled in the silver light. But at its edges, a blue fire flickered. Then holding the star aloft, the bright sword advanced. Frodo, Hobbit of the Shire, walked steadily down to meet the eyes. The phial and the star that is mentioned in this quote is the phial of Galadriel, which we did an episode on in season 1. So you can go and listen to that if you would like more context to what this phial is, this light that Frodo has. But yeah, just a little bit of context there. And also, how fucking boss is Frodo for just like taking his sword out, using it as a light along with the phial and just walking like face first into a giant spider. So though Shelob fled at the sight of the phial and Sting, the latter came in quite handy against the mesh of sticky webs she had woven. So after Shelob's sneak attack on Frodo, it was time for Sting to be wielded by another hand. We know that to be our sweet boy Samwise, who chronically does his best. And you know that to be especially true in my erotic fanfiction episodes. Anyways, guess what time it is? It's time for a 60-second ad break. I'm just kidding. It's quote time, but you better believe the minute I can shill Audible and HelloFresh, I'm going to. So, Samwise sprang forward with a yell and seized his master's sword in his left hand. Then he charged. No onslaught more fierce was ever seen in the savage world of beasts, where some desperate small creature armed with little teeth alone will spring upon a tower of horn and hide that stands above its fallen mate. So after slashing away one of her claws and poking out an eye, Samwise gashed the giant spider in the side before she, and I quote, heaved up the great bag of her belly high above Sam's head. Poison frothed and bubbled from the wound. Now splaying her legs, she drove her huge bulk down on him again. Too soon, for Sam still stood upon his feet, and dropping his own sword with both hands, he held the elven blade point upwards, bending off that ghastly roof. And so, Shelob, with the driving force of her own cruel will, with strength greater than any warrior's hand, thrust herself upon a bitter spike. Deep, deep it pricked as Sam was crushed slowly to the ground. No such anguish had Shelob ever known or dreamed of knowing in all her long world of wickedness. Ooh, that is such a good quote, such a good passage from the book. I love that so much. And Sam is such a sweet one. He's so brave. I mean, Frodo and Sam are both so brave. I love those boys so much. But that is just such a sick passage. Okay. So later, seeing Frodo carried into a side gate of the Tower of Cirith Ungol, Sam yelled and brandished Sting, but his little voice was drowned in the tumult. No one heeded him. However, the next day, Sam found good use for the blade when he awoke and launched a head-on attack against the tower. An orc came clattering down, leaping out of a dark opening at the right. It ran towards him. It was no more than 6 paces from him when, lifting its head, it saw him, and Sam could hear it gasping breath and see the glare in its bloodshot eyes. It stopped short, aghast. For what it saw was not a small, frightened hobbit trying to hold a steady sword. It saw a great silent shape, cloaked in a gray shadow, looming against the wavering light behind. In one hand, it held a sword, the very light of which was a bitter pain. The other was clutched at its breast, but it held concealed some nameless menace of power and doom. So, it wasn't to be the first orc in the tower to flee from Sting. Only moments later, Sam sprang out to meet Shangrat with a shout. He was no longer holding the ring, but it was there, a hidden power, a cowing menace in the slaves of Mordor. And in his hand was Sting, and its light smote the eyes of the orc like the glitter of cruel stars in the terrible elf countries. The dream of which was a cold fear to all his kind, and Shagrat could not both fight and keep hold of his treasure. He stopped, growling, baring his fangs. Then once more, orc fashion, he leapt aside, and as Sam sprang at him, using the heavy bundle as both shield and weapon, he thrust it hard into his enemy's face. Sam staggered, and before he could recover, Shagrat darted past and down the stairs. Are you fucking kidding me? Sam is so brave. He is just taking on an actual orc to get the ring back as he's rescuing Frodo. It's incredible. And I hope you guys, I know this episode is full of like a lot of quotes, which is something I'm not usually very heavy-handed on, but there's just so many good quotes in regards to Sting. And I don't know, I think a lot of these passages are very cool because it has to do with a cool sword, obviously. But also it kind of gives a lot of listeners here that haven't read the books yet and are only fans of the movies some context and color to kind of the prose of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, right? So as I read these quotes, you can kind of understand how, you know, the books are written. And hopefully that is enticing to you movie fans out there. Okay, next. In the chamber where Frodo was being held captive and whipped by an orc, Sam accomplished something reminiscent of Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. With a cry, Sam leapt across the floor, sting in hand. The orc wheeled round, but before it could make a move, Sam slashed its whip hand from its arm. Howling with pain and fear, but desperate, the orc charged, head down at him. Sam's next blow went wide, and thrown off his balance, he fell backwards, clutching at the orc as it stumbled over him. Before he could scramble up, he heard a cry and a thud. The orc in its wild haste had tripped on the ladder head and fallen through the open trap door. That was the very last time Sting was wielded in anger. Frodo did not strike a blow during the scouring of the Shire, and Sting returned to Bag End, where Sam inherited it along with all of Frodo's other possessions when he left for the Grey Havens. Sam, when things are in danger, someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. But you are my heir. All that I had and might have, I leave to you. Ah! That is so pure. I love Frodo and Sam so much. I really, truly do. It is great to see Bilbo pass Sting down to Frodo, who then passes it down to Sam, who is more than deserving and really was the true wielder of Sting. Now that we have context on how Sting was wielded throughout The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Now, it is doubtful that Samwise or any of his numerous descendants ever found cause to use the Elvish Blade again, but with that said, I think it would have been cool to read a story by Tolkien about Sam's much later descendants, or anyone's much later descendants deep into the Fourth Age, since we kind of know, albeit very vaguely, that things in the Fourth Age got kind of weird in a very bittersweet way. But anyways, that's the history of Sting, a very cool sword. I essentially just quoted half the book to you, so if anyone wants to hire me to do audiobooks, I'm not available because that's a terrible idea. Have you heard me? Anyways, you know where to find us. You have my sword podcast. Blah, blah. You have my swordpodcast.com has all links to socials and where you can support. I have been streaming on Twitch a bit, where we have Lord of the Rings discussions, general fantasy discussions. I make a lot of chainmail on my stream, so you can watch me make some mithril. Yeah, and we just have really good discussions about other fantasy series and authors, so come by and contribute or pick up a recommendation in regards to fantasy series. But yeah, you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Krysti Pryde, obviously. As always, keep writing in. Anything that even remotely touches on Tolkien. Did you have sex while the Lord of the Rings extended editions played in the background and cried during the Battle of Pelennor Fields and had to tell your partner it was just allergies? I'll read that. As always, thanks a bunch, and you have my sword.
Edgeworks Nebula.